Now, here at home, there's been a spate of protests in South Africa during the lockdown period. The most recent notable protest action being land invasions in Cape Town by a group calling itself Godfrey Mulaudzi. The Institute for Security Studies says that it's recorded over 500 protests between March and July this year, and it's urged government and political parties to heed the call to put people first or face more protests. Well, to discuss this further, we're now joined via Zoom by researcher for justice and violence prevention at the Institute for Security Studies, Godfrey Mulaudzi. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Mulaudzi. Let's begin with a bit of background, I guess. You know, we often bring up these numbers of the number of protests, but without a context in terms of what has been a norm and where we are now, it's hard to imagine what the figures are telling us. So take us back a little bit. What has been the norm and what have we seen as a trend in recent times?
Thanks, Peter. Good evening to the viewers of SABC. Let me start by joining the country as a whole in expressing my condolences to the family of Bob Mabena with the tragic news of his passing today. May his soul rest in peace. Look, indeed, the state of protest in the country, it's now worrying. And we argue as the Institute that the government needs to start taking it very serious at this point in time. And of course, with the pandemic recently has exposed what we already knew as the gap between or the weakness of socio-economic policies in the country. Now, just to give you the background, in the Institute, we have what is called the Protest and Public Violence Monitor. What the monitor does is to track and record and report the demonstrations that are taking place in the country. So this is purely data-driven, and so it gives us a best indicator of trends over time. So we've started this project in 2013, the beginning of 2013. We from 2013 to 2014, we have seen that in that year, we have pulled a lot of numbers of protests that were taking place. And of course, most of them were very violent protests in their nature, with very few, of course, that were peaceful. And that also brought into fore the policing of public gatherings in the country and the strength and weakness of policing, public order policing as a whole. Now, that's what we do. So what we do is to track this. And of course,
Carry on.
Yes. So we base largely the tracking monitor is basically what it does. It look at incidents of protests that are being reported in the media, in the WhatsApp group, and other sources, some of the sources that we use with other structures, other civil societies within our network of organizations as the Institute. So we get to report them within our monitor. And then we then analyze the data. So the paper you're talking about was purely an analysis of the data that we have since over time, since 2013. But we were looking specifically on the occurrence of these incidents during the lockdown period from March of 2022, July 31st, where we have recorded about 511 number of incidents of protests. But of course, 3 in every 5 of those protests were peaceful. That gives you about 62%, which is a very good, a comforting news to a certain extent that some of these protests are very peaceful because people, of course, they do have their rights. But I mean, in our paper, you'd see we also then point out that people do, in terms of the Constitution, Section 17, have got the rights to peacefully protest. And we've seen that this is the best way that South Africans have always been known to express their frustrations. And this year, during the period of lockdown, has not been an exception as well. And of course, the frustration started. You see, if you look in our data, you'd see that from the beginning of the lockdown, the 27th of March. That's when we had a very tight lockdown regulations, and number of protests were very few. I mean, we've recorded just about.
So what are they protesting about by and large? You're warning politicians. What are you warning them about?
Look, it's the protests are driven by a number of issues, and mostly that rests squarely in the local government sphere. That is the sphere that interface with people in terms of service delivery provisions. But we have categorized these incidents of protest so that we don't use a blanket approach in terms of our data. If you look in our data, you'd see that from that period of 27 March to the 31st of April, out of all those 511 protests, you would have seen Labour has been leading with the number of at about 13%. And this is just within this period. But Labour in itself, and we have seen that we've divided this twofold. There is Labour that is solely squarely within the healthcare sectors, where you find doctors, nurses, and the hospital staff protesting for the lack of or absence of the provisions of the personal protective equipment, the PPEs. But of course, that was also driven by the fear because of they are the frontline staff, the fear of the pandemic itself, confronting the virus. But the other group was the group where you'd find that workers probably have been promised to get the overtime pay. They've been working overtime with a skeleton staff since the beginning of the lockdown. Now, this is the group that falls within the category of labor. We call it a PV type, the public violence type. Now, that was followed by electricity. And with electricity, Peter, I must indicate that the trends, you'd know that in winter, there's usually a high demand of electricity. This year as well was worse because with people being indoor most of the time, municipalities, also some of them struggling to pay ESCOM disconnecting the communities. Yeah. So that has also been, at 10%, they've been number 2. And that's also, mind you, again, that this was just squarely within the period of 27 March to the end of July. And of course, the incidents are continuing.
Or do you think that the politicians are listening to the protesters, listening to the people, that they resort to protest action eventually? I think in your paper you noted that despite the population of South Africa increasing significantly since 1994, that in the last election, less people voted than they did in 94, which is quite telling, isn't it?
Indeed. And yet they're still going in the street in numbers to voice out their frustrations. And look, these are... yes, Peter.
Yeah, so I'm just saying, do you think the politicians are listening to the plight of the protesters and society in general? And just before you answer that question, I'd just like to say welcome to our viewers on SABC 3. And we're talking, they haven't joined us yet. They're joining us in a couple of moments' time. And we're going to welcome, in fact, SABC 3, welcome to the program. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. We're talking about an interesting study that's just come out by the Institute for Security Studies. The number of protests in the country have increased significantly in the past few months, particularly during the lockdown. And we're trying to unpack the reason for this. And we're talking to Mr. Mulaudzi, who's a researcher there. Mr. Mulaudzi, so again, I'll ask you the question about whether the politicians are listening and paying attention, because in the end, if someone isn't being heard, they probably feel that the only way they can get their voice heard is to protest, because they don't seem to be doing it at the polls.
Indeed, Peter. Look, the data that we have suggests that with the increasing number of violence protests, when people take to the street, it means it's an expression of frustrations, of not being heard, of voices that they're not being heard. And, the right of freedom to assemble, it's basically... it's to give voice to the voiceless. So it exists primarily just for that, to give voices to those groups that may not be having economic power. So we don't think that politicians are actually, particularly, and I want to emphasize, Peter, that particularly the politicians within the leaderships within the local government, we have seen a situation where local leadership needs to go and respond, but we see police being the one to go and being mandated to deal with the protests. And that is not really supposed to be, because people, I would give you an example in Gugulet, for example. The fire station was blocked by community because they didn't want the fire engine to go to put down the fire, because they felt that What they needed was the community leaders to come and address them, the municipal leaders to come and address them. So we don't think that there is enough ear from the side of the leadership to the communities. And that's why you would see, as you said, that the 2019 elections had witnessed the lowest voter turnout as compared to any other 6 previous elections. So we think that this right of protest, of course, it's a very fundamental right in our constitutional democracy that give voices to those voiceless people, those voiceless groups. Now it is up to the local communities, local leadership to then start to engage frequently with these people, not to just, send police and then they will then go and respond when there's cow. Otherwise, so that is what we think that is one of the indicators that point that we see that for as long as lockdown is still here, we're still going to see more and more violence of protests that will take place within communities.